I don't even know how to word this without sounding bitter, but maybe bitter is the right word. For almost a decade, I woke up at 5 a.m. every single day to help keep my family's business running. It wasn't glamorous work. It wasn't even work I particularly loved. But it was ours, our family legacy, something my parents had built from nothing, and something they constantly reminded me I'd one day inherit alongside my brother. At least that's what they used to say. The truth is, I was the one who knew the ins and outs of the business. I was the one answering customer calls, negotiating with vendors, staying late to close deals, cleaning up paperwork that my brother forgot about. My brother, let's call him Ethan, was the golden child. He could stroll into the office at noon with a coffee in hand, make a few phone calls, and my parents would act like he had just saved the entire company. Meanwhile, if I so much as took a day off to rest, I'd get a lecture about commitment and sacrifice. Still, I stayed. I told myself that one day it would pay off. That one day my parents would recognize who was truly keeping the business afloat. That one day I'd be rewarded for my loyalty. That one day never came. Instead, about 3 years ago, I was called into my parents' office. I still remember how stiff my dad looked behind the desk, like he had rehearsed a speech. My mom wouldn't even meet my eyes. I thought maybe someone had died. But no, it was worse in its own way. They told me they had to make cuts because of declining profits. That I was, unfortunately, one of the expenses they had to let go. I was stunned. I literally laughed at first, because I thought it was some kind of sick joke. But when I realized they were serious, I asked the obvious question. Why me? Why not Ethan? He barely does anything. My dad just sighed and said, your brother's role is different. He's the face of the company. He has client relationships we can't afford to lose. Client relationships? The man couldn't even remember our biggest supplier's name half the time. But none of that mattered. The decision was made. They slid an envelope across the desk. 2-week severance. After nearly 10 years of my life, I left that office feeling like my chest had been ripped open. It wasn't just about the job, it was the betrayal. My own parents had chosen to keep the lazy, entitled son while discarding the one who had been bleeding for the business. I had no savings, no backup plan, no safety net. They knew that too. They knew I had given up other opportunities to keep their dream alive. I walked out into the parking lot and sat in my car for an hour, numb. All I could think was, they fired me. My own parents fired me. At the time, I thought my life was over. I couldn't see beyond the humiliation, the anger, the fear of what came next. I had no idea that being pushed out that door would eventually lead me somewhere bigger. Somewhere that would put me in a position of power I never imagined I'd have. But back then, I was just broken. And the worst part was knowing Ethan was probably sitting in my chair, sipping his overpriced latte, without a care in the world. The days after being fired felt like a blur. I'd wake up at the same time out of habit, 5 a.m., only to remember I had nowhere to go. My whole routine, my whole identity, had been wrapped up in that business. Suddenly, I wasn't the operations manager, the fixer, the go-to person anymore. I was just unemployed. It wasn't just the loss of income that hurt, though that was brutal enough. Rent doesn't pay itself, and I had always been careful but not rich. The real gut punch came from how easily my parents seemed to move on. Not once in those first weeks did they call me to check how I was doing. Not once did they say, "We're sorry, we know this is hard." Instead, my mom sent me a text, saying, "We hope you understand this was for the best. We'll always love you, but this was a business decision." A business decision. That phrase burned into my brain. That's what I had been reduced to, a line item on a spreadsheet, something to be trimmed away to save money. Meanwhile, Ethan was thriving, or at least he thought he was. My parents promoted him to Vice President of Client Relations. Basically, they gave him a fancy title so he could strut around like he owned the place. I'd hear from mutual acquaintances that he was bragging about being the future of the company. That stung worse than I'd like to admit. My friends tried to comfort me, saying things like, "This might be a blessing in disguise," or "Now you can finally live for yourself." But I wasn't ready to hear that. I was angry, humiliated, and scared. The worst part was running into my parents at family gatherings. I tried avoiding them at first, but it's hard to dodge Thanksgiving when your whole extended family expects you there. That year, dinner was a nightmare. My uncle asked me how work was going, clearly unaware of what had happened, and before I could answer, my dad jumped in with, "Oh, he's taking some time to figure out his next steps." Like I was some lost teenager instead of the person they had relied on for years. When my uncle pressed, I admitted I had been let go. The table went silent for a second, and then Ethan, of course, laughed. "Yeah, Mom and Dad had to tighten the ship. Not everyone can handle the pressure, you know?" I saw red. My fork actually snapped in my hand from how tightly I was gripping it. I wanted to scream that he was dead weight, that I had been the one running things while he was busy playing golf or posting motivational quotes on LinkedIn. But I kept my mouth shut, because deep down I knew it wouldn't matter. My parents would defend him. They always did. That night, I left early and sat in my car for what felt like hours, just replaying the scene over and over. The betrayal wasn't just professional, it was personal. They hadn't just fired me from the business. They had fired me from the family dream, from the future I thought we were all building together. I promised myself then and there that I would never, ever put myself in a position where they could pull the rug out from under me again. If I was going to rebuild, it would be on my own terms. No handouts, no favors, no illusions that blood meant loyalty. I didn't know how yet, but I knew one thing. I was done being the expendable one. Rock bottom doesn't announce itself. It just creeps up on you until you wake up one morning and realize you've lost everything you thought defined you. That was me, sitting in my tiny apartment surrounded by piles of resumes I had sent out with no response. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't the reliable one. I was just another unemployed 30-something with no degree beyond high school and family business, as my only real line of experience. The worst part? I had built that resume myself brick by brick. Every vendor relationship, every system upgrade, every efficiency I'd implemented, it was all my work. But because my parents had never given me a proper title, it looked like I had been a glorified assistant under management supervision. Translation: Ethan got the credit. Still, I couldn't sit in self-pity forever. Rent was due, bills were stacking up, and food doesn't magically appear in the fridge. So I swallowed my pride and applied everywhere. Restaurants, retail, warehouses. Eventually, I landed a temp job doing admin work for a mid-sized logistics company. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a lifeline. At first, I kept my head down, just grateful for the paycheck. But old habits die hard. Within a few weeks, I noticed inefficiencies. Inventory processes that didn't make sense, shipment delays that could have been avoided, communication breakdowns between departments. I started quietly fixing little things. No one asked me to, but I couldn't help myself. Then one day, the operations manager called me into his office. I half expected to get scolded for overstepping, but instead, he said, "You've been here 6 weeks and already saved us more headaches than most of my staff in a year. Ever thought about a career in logistics?" I laughed, because career felt like a foreign word. But he was serious. He offered me a permanent position with benefits and hinted at a promotion if I kept performing. For the first time since being fired, I felt seen. I grabbed that opportunity with both hands. I worked like hell, but it didn't feel like the same kind of draining, thankless grind as before. Every late night, every idea I pitched, it was actually acknowledged. My new boss wasn't perfect, but he respected effort, and he noticed results. Over the next 2 years, I rose from temp to team lead, then to assistant operations director. I took courses, built certifications, and for the first time in my life, invested in my future instead of someone else's. Slowly but surely, I was carving out an identity that wasn't tied to my parents or Ethan. And then came the turning point. I got recruited. A major player in the industry, ironically one of my parents' biggest competitors, had heard about me through a vendor I'd worked with. They reached out, offering me a position with more responsibility and a salary that honestly made my jaw drop. I hesitated for about 5 seconds before saying yes. Walking into that new office on my first day, I felt something I hadn't in years. Freedom. I wasn't someone's expendable child anymore. I wasn't a placeholder until Ethan got his act together. I was building something real with people who valued what I brought to the table. And as the months passed, I couldn't ignore the irony. I was helping a rival company sharpen its edge, streamline its systems, and grow stronger, while hearing whispers that my parents' business was struggling. First, I brushed it off. It wasn't my problem anymore. But deep down, I felt the first flicker of something I hadn't expected. Satisfaction. I didn't just fit in, I thrived. I started out in operations management, but within months, I was spearheading projects that cut costs, reduced errors, and boosted efficiency across entire divisions. I'd built those skills in the trenches of my parents' company, but here they were appreciated, recognized, rewarded. And it wasn't just about money, though the salary still felt unreal compared to the scraps I'd been earning before. It was about respect. My ideas carried weight. My contributions mattered. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't someone's second choice. I wasn't competing against Ethan's charm or my parents' blind favoritism. I was just me, and that was enough. The turning point came during a quarterly review meeting with the executive team. I'd presented a proposal for restructuring regional operations that would save the company millions annually. When I finished, there was silence in the room, the kind that makes you second-guess every word. Then the COO, a no-nonsense woman who rarely praised anyone, said, "Why aren't you running this department already?" The room chuckled, but a month later that joke became reality. I was promoted to director of operations, with a team of over 100 people under me. From there, the momentum just kept building. Within 2 years, I was sitting at the executive table weighing in on strategy and expansion. My parents would have laughed in my face if I'd told them I'd ever reach this level. Yet here I was, in my early 30s, helping lead a company that was slowly eating into their market share. And oh, did I notice? Vendors I used to negotiate with at my parents' business were now approaching me, eager to partner with TransCore. Clients who had grown frustrated with my parents' outdated systems were flocking to us for reliability. Every time I signed a new contract, I couldn't help but think of the conversations my parents must be having behind closed doors. I didn't seek revenge. It wasn't like I had some master plan to take them down. But success has a funny way of rewriting the story. The more I rose, the clearer it became that firing me hadn't just been a betrayal. It had been their biggest mistake. I won't lie, part of me enjoyed imagining Ethan's reaction. He was probably still coasting on his title, still showing up late, still getting applauded for the bare minimum. Meanwhile, the kid they tossed aside was helping build the very empire threatening to crush them. Sometimes, when I couldn't sleep, I'd catch myself scrolling through their company's financials. Public records showed enough to paint a picture. The numbers weren't good. Declining revenue, increasing debt, missed targets year after year. It was like watching a slow-motion car crash. And I couldn't look away. The first real confirmation that my parents' business was circling the drain didn't come from them directly. It came from the industry grapevine. Vendors talk. Clients talk even more. And by the time I had settled comfortably into my role at TransCore, the whispers had become hard to ignore. "Have you heard about Family Co?" Someone would ask over drinks after a conference. "They're bleeding cash." Or, "I used to work with them, but they can't keep their promises anymore. Total mess." I'd pretend to be mildly interested, nodding and asking the right questions, while inside, something dark and conflicted twisted in my chest. On one hand, it was painful to hear about the company I had poured myself into going downhill. On the other, I couldn't help but feel grim satisfaction. They had thrown me away, kept Ethan, and now they were reaping exactly what they had sown. The cracks were everywhere. For starters, they had lost 2 of their biggest clients I had personally built relationships with because orders kept getting delayed and communication was sloppy. Then there were staffing issues. Word was that turnover had skyrocketed. Good employees don't stick around when leadership is inconsistent and the boss's son strolls around acting like he's untouchable. The final straw, though, was a conversation I had with one of our vendors, someone who used to deal with me back in the family business days. He leaned in during lunch and said quietly, "Look, between you and me, They're not going to last another 2 years if they keep going like this. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need them. I could already imagine the chaos. Unpaid invoices piling up, Ethan dodging responsibility, my parents scrambling to hold things together with outdated methods. What surprised me most was how little sympathy I felt. Maybe that sounds cold, but I couldn't muster any real pity. They had chosen this. They had chosen Ethan. They had chosen to treat me like an expense instead of the backbone of their operation. Now the whole structure was crumbling. What I didn't know yet was just how personal it would get. Because it wasn't long before the whispers stopped being background noise and started knocking directly on my door. The first sign came in the form of a LinkedIn message from a former colleague at Family Co. "Hey, are you hearing what's going on with your parents' company? They might be looking for outside help. You should reach out." I didn't reply, but I stared at that message for a long time. Outside help. The idea of me swooping back in to clean up the disaster they had created felt almost laughable. But it also planted a seed. And sure enough, a few weeks later, that seed sprouted. My mom called me. Something she hadn't done in months, maybe years. Her voice was shaky in a way I'd never heard before. After a few minutes of awkward small talk, she finally admitted, "We're struggling. The business isn't doing well. We could really use your help." I sat there in silence, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. My own parents, who had tossed me aside like garbage, were now asking me to save them. When my mom first said the words, "We could really use your help," I honestly thought I had misheard her. I asked her to repeat herself, and she did, this time with a little more desperation in her voice. The irony was almost too much. 3 years earlier, they had looked me in the eye and told me I was nothing more than an expense, disposable, unnecessary. Now suddenly I was the one they needed. I asked as calmly as I could, "What about Ethan?" There was a pause. Then she said, "He's doing his best, but you know how hard this industry is. He's more of a big-picture thinker. He needs support." Support. That word made my blood boil. I had supported Ethan my entire life. I had cleaned up his messes, covered his mistakes, carried his dead weight, and it had gotten me fired. And now they wanted me to come back and support him again, as if nothing had happened? I didn't commit to anything on that call. I told her I'd think about it. In reality, I just sat there afterwards staring at the wall, caught between rage and a twisted sense of satisfaction. They were finally seeing the consequences of their choices. But the calls didn't stop. My dad reached out next, his tone much more businesslike. He tried to frame it as an opportunity. "This is still your legacy too. We know you have the skills to turn things around. You'd be compensated fairly this time." Fairly. As if that erased the betrayal. As if money could fix years of favoritism and being treated like second class in my own family. The real kicker came when Ethan himself called me. He didn't even bother with humility. Instead, he said, "Look, Mom and Dad think you can help stabilize things. If you come back, I'll make sure you get a good position under me." Under him. The audacity. He was offering me a subordinate role in the very business I had once run circles around him in. Like he was the king generously granting me a seat at his table. I laughed in his face. Literally. He got defensive, muttered something about family sticking together, and then hung up when I wouldn't stop laughing. The truth was, part of me wanted to say yes. Not because I wanted to help them, but because I wanted to walk in, take control, and prove once and for all who the real leader was. But the other part of me remembered that no matter how much I saved them, Ethan would still be their golden boy. They'd still twist the story, give him the credit, and leave me with the scraps. And then, just as I was wrestling with this decision, fate threw me a curveball. At TransCore, our leadership team started discussing a potential acquisition. The target? You guessed it, my parents' company. Suddenly, it wasn't just about whether I'd go back to help them. It was about whether I'd stand by and watch as the company I helped build swallowed the one that had tossed me aside. When I first heard that TransCore was eyeing my parents' company as an acquisition target, my stomach dropped. For weeks, I couldn't think straight. On one hand, this was business. Acquisitions happen all the time, and my role at TransCore meant I'd be directly involved in evaluating the deal. Objectively, Family Co. was a weak competitor with dwindling market share and outdated practices. From a strategy standpoint, it made perfect sense to swoop in, buy them out, and absorb their client base. On the other hand, it was my family, my parents, my brother, the people who had shaped my life in ways I still hadn't fully unpacked. Could I really sit at the table and essentially vote for their downfall? Guilt started gnawing at me. I'd picture my mom's face when she called me, her voice cracking as she admitted they were struggling. I'd remember Sunday dinners as a kid, when we all dreamed aloud about how our company would one day dominate the industry. I'd hear my dad's favorite line, "This is for the family, always for the family." But then, almost like a reflex, the anger would come flooding back. I'd replay the moment they fired me, the way my dad slid that envelope across the desk without even looking me in the eye. I'd hear Ethan's mocking laugh at Thanksgiving. I'd see the text from my mom, reducing me to a business decision. Family? They had already made their choice. Still, the conflict ate at me. At night, I'd lie awake imagining two futures. In one, I stepped in, helped stabilize Family Co., and earned my parents' gratitude, maybe even repaired the fractured bond. In the other, I stood aside, let the acquisition roll forward, and finally watched justice play out. I'll admit, there was a dark thrill in the second scenario. The idea of sitting across the table from my parents as a representative of TransCore, watching their faces when they realized their former expendable expense now had the power to dictate their fate. It was intoxicating. But then I'd feel a wave of guilt so heavy it made me nauseous. Who was I if I let my own parents drown? Didn't that make me just as heartless as they had been to me? The internal tug-of-war became unbearable. I started avoiding their calls again, dodging every attempt at contact. My mom left voicemails that grew increasingly desperate. "We can't do this without you." My dad sent emails full of numbers and charts, as if data alone could convince me. Ethan, predictably, sent nothing. He probably assumed I'd cave eventually. At TransCore, the pressure was mounting too. The CEO asked me directly during one strategy session, "What's your take on Family Co? Worth pursuing?" I froze. My career, my family, my identity, all colliding in that one question. I managed a diplomatic answer about due diligence and further evaluation. But inside, I was spiraling. I kept thinking, if I save them, I betray myself. If I let them fall, I betray my family. Which betrayal was worse? The first official acquisition meeting was surreal. I sat in a sleek conference room at TransCore headquarters, surrounded by executives in tailored suits, while a slideshow projected financials that felt like déjà vu: declining revenue, rising debt, shrinking client base, employee turnover at nearly 40%. Every bullet point was a scar I recognized. I didn't need the spreadsheets to tell me how bad it was. I had lived through the beginnings of that collapse years ago. Still, seeing it laid out in cold, hard numbers gave me a strange sense of distance, like I was watching the autopsy of a body I once knew. The CEO outlined the opportunity. If we acquire Family Co., we get access to their remaining clients, their facilities, and their brand recognition in certain regions. At a distressed valuation, it's a bargain. Then all eyes shifted to me. "You know them better than anyone," the COO said. "What's your assessment?" I felt the weight of that question like a boulder on my chest. Here I was, the former expendable child, now being asked to judge the very company that had cast me out. I spoke carefully, choosing my words like stepping stones across a river. "They have infrastructure worth salvaging, but leadership is a liability. Without significant restructuring, they'll collapse within 18 months. No one argued. No one questioned me. My word carried weight. It hit me then. I wasn't just a participant in this process. I was the key. My evaluation could determine whether Family Co. got a lifeline or a death sentence. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the scene in my parents' office the day they fired me. My dad's sigh, my mom's averted eyes, Ethan's smug grin later on. They had all treated me like a footnote. And now I was writing the next chapter. The irony wasn't lost on me. They had tossed me aside thinking I was worthless. But the skills, the grit, the relentless work ethic I'd honed in their shadow had turned me into the very person who could decide their fate. A week later, things escalated. My parents reached out again, this time with an offer. They wanted me to come back not just as an employee, but as a partner. "We'll cut you in on ownership," my dad said over the phone, like he was dangling treasure. But I knew better. Ownership in a sinking ship is still ownership in a sinking ship. And besides, I could see through the desperation in his voice. This wasn't generosity. This was survival. Meanwhile, at TransCore, the acquisition team was sharpening their knives. Draft proposals were drawn up, valuation models were circulated, and I was asked to contribute directly to the integration plan, how we'd absorb Famalicio's assets and restructure their operations. For the first time, I realized the scale of my power. I wasn't just choosing whether or not to save them. I was in the position to take everything. Sitting in my office late one night, staring at two folders, one from my dad, one from TransCore, I felt like the universe was testing me. One folder represented blood, history, and betrayal. The other represented everything I had built for myself out of the ashes. And I knew I couldn't choose both. The decision didn't come to me in a single lightning bolt moment. It was more like a slow tightening in my chest, a steady clarity that built with each passing day. I'd sit in meetings at TransCore, reviewing projections that showed how smoothly the acquisition could go, and a voice in my head whispered, "This is justice. This is balance." Then I'd listen to voicemails from my mom, her voice breaking as she begged me to just come home. And another voice whispered, "This is cruelty. This is betrayal." For weeks, I felt like I was being torn in two. But the truth is, the answer was there all along. I just hadn't wanted to admit it. The night before the final strategy session, I sat alone in my apartment with both folders in front of me again. My dad's desperate partnership offer and TransCore's acquisition plan. My dad's folder was thinner, half-baked promises, vague figures, desperate scribbles. TransCore's was polished, airtight, undeniable. I thought about who I was when I left that office 3 years ago. Broken, humiliated, stripped of everything. And I thought about who I was now. Respected, valued, leading a team, shaping the future of an industry. One version of me owed my parents everything. The other owed them nothing. When I walked into the boardroom the next morning, I knew exactly where I stood. "The acquisition makes sense," I told the executive team. "Famalicio's assets can be leveraged, but leadership must be completely replaced. If we move fast, we'll secure their clients before they jump ship. I recommend proceeding." The vote was unanimous. Famaliccio was on the chopping block. A week later, I sat across from my parents in a negotiation meeting. It was the first time I'd seen them face to face in months. My dad looked older, his shoulders slumped in a way I had never seen before. My mom's hands trembled as she clutched her coffee cup. Ethan wasn't even there. Apparently he had other commitments. Typical. When they realized I was part of the acquisition team, the shock on their faces was indescribable. My mom whispered my name like it was a prayer. My dad cleared his throat and said, "So, you're really doing this?" I didn't gloat. I didn't lecture. I just said, "It's business." The same words they had thrown at me when they fired me. I watched the recognition flicker in their eyes. My mom's face crumpled. My dad looked like he'd been punched. The negotiations dragged on, but the outcome was inevitable. TransCore took over Famaliccio at a distressed price. My parents kept a fraction of their former wealth, enough to live on, but the empire they had built was gone. And Ethan? He was cut out entirely. That night, I drove past the old office building. The lights were dim, the parking lot half empty. I remembered all the mornings I had pulled in before sunrise, exhausted but determined, believing I was working towards something bigger. Now, it belonged to someone else. For the first time, I felt the weight of what I had done. Relief, yes. Justice, maybe. But also grief. Because in the end, I hadn't just dismantled a company. I had dismantled a family dream. And I couldn't shake the question echoing in my head. Had I done the right thing? The days after the acquisition were surreal. TransCore was humming along, integrating Famalicio's assets, and I was at the center of it all. Every process I had once implemented at my parents' company was now being reworked under my direction, but this time with efficiency, accountability, and respect. Meanwhile, the fallout at home was complicated. My parents stopped calling as often, though I still received occasional texts dripping with guilt or thinly veiled anger. "We never imagined you'd do this," my dad wrote one evening. My mom's messages were more emotional. "We raised you better than this. Family matters." Ethan, predictably, was furious. He confronted me once at a family gathering, his face red with humiliation and rage. "You ruined everything. You could have saved us and you just let it die." I listened quietly. My answer was the same as it had been throughout this entire ordeal. Nothing. Words wouldn't fix what had already been broken. He had had every advantage. I had been discarded. History was repeating itself if I tried to act otherwise. Friends and colleagues at Transcore congratulated me, calling it a brilliant business move, a power play, a masterstroke. And yes, on a purely professional level it was, but emotionally I was conflicted. I kept replaying the phone calls, the Thanksgiving dinners, the late nights working double shifts, the sacrifices I had made while Ethan sipped lattes and smiled for the cameras. And now, seeing them struggle, even if it was partly karmic, still made me uneasy. Some nights, I catch myself wondering, did I go too far? Could I have done something to help without compromising myself or my career? Could I have walked a line between loyalty and justice? But then I remember how it felt to be thrown out, to be treated like I was nothing. I remember the bitterness of their favoritism, the humiliation, the crushing sense of betrayal. And I realized that sometimes self-preservation isn't just acceptable, it's necessary. I've tried to keep perspective. I didn't steal from them. I didn't sabotage them. I simply let business happen as business does. And in business, emotions rarely save failing companies. I only had the power to save them if I wanted to, and I chose not to. So here I am, sitting in my office at Transcore, watching the company I once poured myself into rise under my hands, while my parents adjust to a much smaller world. I don't know if I'll ever forgive myself entirely, or if they'll ever see me differently than the child they discarded. All I know is the world doesn't reward loyalty when it's one-sided. And sometimes, justice and revenge are two sides of the same coin. AITA for refusing to save my parents' company after everything that happened?